Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous Wednesday here in the East. Today, as you know, is the 23rd day of September in the year 2015. The weather is absolutely gorgeous. I understand as we head towards the weekend, it's going to get a little bit sour, but right now it is absolutely beautiful out there today. A wonderful fall day temperature. Right now it's in the upper 60s, I would guess, and it's supposed to go into the lower 70s during the afternoon. I hope that the weather is as nice as it is here where you are. I know that obviously in some places it's not, but it is a beautiful time of the year, and I welcome you to the Virtual Center. On this, a full broadcast day for us, a full program, 2-hour program. And I remind you, of course, that today is our final day of live broadcasts on the Head On Radio Network for this week, and we will be back at our regular time, which is 1 p.m. on Monday, for a full week of broadcasting as well. I do invite you to share your thoughts and your ideas, suggestions, comments, with our other listeners by using the phone line that we have made available just for the purpose of getting you on the air. Our number, the number that you would call to get on the air is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, and I understand that some people would feel much more comfortable doing that than they would getting on the air, then by all means I invite you to do that. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And again, I remind you that now for the last 6 or 7 weeks or so, we've had a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our website. And I have posted a number of articles there that pieces that I've written related specifically to issues and concepts that we have been dealing with here at the Virtual Center in recent weeks. Although I will admit that I haven't really put a full piece on the Facebook page for some time, and I do intend to do that probably in the next day or two. I'm waiting. I have had an article in the hopper, so to speak, it's been submitted to the Charleston Gazette. I received notification that it was received, and I'm kind of waiting for that particular piece to run because that's one that I would like to put on the Facebook page, but I don't want to do it until it actually appears in the Charleston Gazette. And since then, since I have submitted that, and they do have a policy that they only allow an entry into the Gazette, one per month. So, again, it was toward the middle of August, that I had my last piece published there. So I do understand I don't have any problem waiting. And there seems to have been a pattern established where most of the things that I've submitted tend to run on Sundays. So I'm kind of anticipating and hoping that perhaps I'll be seeing that piece coming out in the next over this coming weekend. I do hope so. If not this weekend, then perhaps next weekend. But as I mentioned, in the process, I've kind of completed a couple more. So I have a number of pieces in waiting. I don't want to send them one until they have dealt with the previous one that I sent. But anyway. I'd like to put some of these on the Facebook page, and again, I don't like to do it until if publication is pending. I'd rather wait until the publication happens. But I do invite you to go to the Facebook page. I do occasionally put comments up there related to the issues, related to our program, relate to some of the issues of the day. I know, for example, today, about an hour ago, a little bit more than an hour ago, I posted an item which it just dawned to me that it's a very strange day. I spent about an hour this morning watching the Pope and the President on the lawn of the White House. The President welcoming the Pope to the United States, and then they went into the White House for a private conference, and the Pope's hectic schedule will really pick up from what I understand and what they were talking about this afternoon. And I was thinking I couldn't resist putting this on the Facebook page because it's such a dramatic contradiction, and it kind of deals with the world we live in so clearly. On the same day that the Pope arrives in the United States, we get word this morning that the one and only Yogi Berra passed away last evening at the age of 90 years. And I don't know whether those of you listening are baseball fans or not, but I grew up, obviously, in Boston, so therefore the Yankees were our nemesis, so to speak. But at the same time, there was nowhere in the world that you couldn't love Yogi Berra, and I always did. He killed us over the years, but I loved him, and he didn't disappoint. His record is astounding. His record after he retired from active playing was astounding. He managed the Yankees to a World Championship. He managed the Mets to a World Championship. And, of course, he's known for all of these absolutely delightful, delicious expressions, that tends to create in the minds of younger people who weren't able to see him play, the idea that he was kind of a buffoon. He was far from it. He was one of the greatest ball players that ever lived, and one of the greatest men, as well, as we're hearing today during the accolades being discussed today in celebration of the life of Yogi Berra. And I just couldn't resist the fact that on the same day that the Pope comes to the United States, we lose Yogi Berra. And then on the other side of on the back page of the same thing, one of the headlines in this morning's newspapers is the fact that the CEO of Volkswagen resigned in disgrace after accepting responsibility for the duplicitous behavior of Volkswagen in finding ways to duck some of the emissions tests on many of its diesel automobiles. And, of course, we still continue to deal with the head of Touring Pharmaceuticals, who raised the price of the medication 5,000%. And unlike the CEO at Volkswagen, this guy's not resigning. He's defending the right of free enterprise and the right to pursue profit at whatever the cost. And I just think it is so incredible that on the one hand you have the Pope, and especially his recent encyclical on climate change, and then you have Yogi Berra, and on the other hand you have behavior on the part of two of the most powerful individuals in the business world today, showing us exactly why we need encyclicals and why we need to try to find ways to live according to the dictates of those encyclicals. It just seems an incredible contrast. It just struck me. So I put that on Facebook this morning as kind of an announcement of the fact that we were going to be beginning our program at 1 p.m. today, and that we were going to be focusing for the most part of our program on the Constitution of the United States, and more specifically on the impact that Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution has had on our understanding and reading of the Constitution from the very earliest period of the 20th century up to the present. Again, I remind you that, of the phone number, and I do encourage you to avail yourselves of this opportunity to share your thoughts and share your ideas with other people that are tuning in. And again, I just one more time remind you, our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. Without taking too much time away from today's program by spending that time in review of what we did yesterday, which in effect was a review of what we did last week when we were last together. You will recall, if you were with us yesterday, and if you weren't, that's the reason I mentioned this, because it brings you right up to speed and gives you an opportunity to tie in directly to what we're going to be focusing most of our time on today. We spent some time looking at the relationship between the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. More specifically, we were focused on the so-called natural rights philosophies and the basic argument of scholarship within the context of the natural rights philosophers, if you will, which basically establishes a direct link between the Declaration and the Constitution of the United States. And of course, by asserting that direct link, the natural rights philosophers are emphasizing that the Constitution of the United States is principally an implementation document, namely a document intended from the very beginning to implement the philosophy that is articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And we spent quite a bit of time yesterday talking about the fact that there's too much historical evidence to the contrary, it seems to me, to validate this entire issue. There's absolutely no question that the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence as such did not really become prominent, did not become the prominent feature of the Declaration or the most prominent creed about the mission, if you will, of America as a nation until the philosophy of the Declaration was resurrected by Abraham Lincoln 100 years later. And of course, Lincoln's agenda was quite different. He was facing the debate over the nature of the Union and the threat of the southern states to secede. And as we know, with his election as president in 1860, Southern secession indeed actually happened, and the nation did end up in one of the most horrible wars that one can possibly contemplate. But in the build-up to that conflict, Lincoln continually emphasized the philosophy of the Declaration and urged the nation to begin to take it seriously and to abide by it. He even mentioned the fact that this paragraph of the Declaration of Independence ought to stand as America's creed, and indeed it has. But the problem is to imply that that was the intent of Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration 100 years earlier, is invalid. And that's what the natural rights philosophers are aiming to do, namely to suggest that what Lincoln focused on in the middle of the 19th century was merely a resurrection of what Jefferson focused on in the 18th century. The fact of the matter is, Jefferson's intent at the time of the Declaration was to state what he called self-evident truths. Those beliefs about the nature of Republican government and about issues related to natural rights, or as he called them, unalienable rights, that were generally accepted throughout the thinking world at that time. His intent was merely to state what indeed existed at that time, because his agenda was to contrast the behavior of the mother country with that particular philosophy in order to demonstrate or to justify the right of the colonists to seek independence, because the mother country had indeed violated the trust and the confidence as well as the implied contract that individual Americans had with the mother country. And so basically Jefferson's agenda was principally political, not ideological. But the natural rights philosophers must insist that Jefferson's agenda is indeed ideological. And so what they are doing is imposing the circumstances and the conditions which existed in the middle of the 19th century for President, well, at this time he wasn't president, not until 1860, of Abraham Lincoln, onto the philosophy behind the Declaration of Independence. But more significant than that, it seems to me, is that when you render the Constitution of the United States as an implementation document, rather than a document that can stand on its own, it seems to me, you really do demean the significance of the document. Because in emphasizing the philosophy of the Declaration, you are obviously downplaying the significance of the Constitution of the United States. And as we know, the Constitution of the United States was drafted for its own particular reasons, and they are related to what was going on in the nation during the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution of the United States was designed to replace the Articles of Confederation, and as we know, that switch with the ratification of the Constitution did happen. One of the things that I mentioned yesterday, and this is again is still continuing a review from yesterday, one of the things that seemed to me very significant yesterday was the question as to why. Why is it that this linkage, this direct link between the Declaration and the Constitution is so important to the natural rights philosophers? And the answer to that question revolves around the issue of property. These people, these advocates, contemporary advocates of natural rights, are also advocates and supporters of the idea of free enterprise capitalism. And their basic idea is to reduce government and limit government's interference in the operations of the economy as much as possible. And the way to do that is to link today's government to the limited government that Jefferson defined in the Declaration of Independence, whose purpose was principally to protect, to defend the unalienable rights of man. And their intent, of course, is to include property amongst those unalienable rights. And to do that, they are insistent, they must be insistent, that the Declaration of Independence is directly related and owes its origins to the philosophy of John Locke, because John Locke's state of nature philosophy of the late 17th century, in his second treatise on civil government, incorporated or included property as one of man's natural rights in the state of nature. So the connection seems to be somewhat direct. Locke's natural rights of life, liberty, and property transpose or transfer seemingly very easily into Jefferson's unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what's necessary, of course, is to establish the fact that Locke's property and Jefferson's pursuit of happiness are in effect the same thing. That the reason Jefferson used happiness is primarily for political purposes, namely to get the Declaration through Congress. The fact of the matter is, and this is where we I think, concluded our program yesterday. The fact of the matter is the meaning of the word happiness in the 18th century was very, very unique and very, very specific. And if you look at the literature and the correspondence of the 18th century, the way these folks used happiness did not revolve around what benefits came to you, but rather what you could do with what you had to bring happiness to others. Happiness in the 18th century was related to giving, not to receiving. It was, in a sense, the ability to bring goodwill and good things to other people, to help your fellow man. The emphasis was on the common good, not the individual rights to the accumulation of property. And therefore, there are serious questions as to whether, in fact, the philosophy that is being pushed, promoted by the natural rights philosophers, is legitimate. I would suggest to you that there are serious questions associated with this. And it deals not only with the issue of happiness, the pursuit of happiness in Jefferson's Declaration, it also revolves around the issue of unalienable rights. Unalienable, in Jefferson's language, in Jefferson's time, meant what Locke called natural. That these rights were rights granted to man by the Creator, therefore only the Creator could rescind those rights. When it came to your life, for example, you did not have the power to take your own life. It was not yours. It was a gift from God. And only God had the right to take your life. You did not. Locke spends quite a bit of time talking about suicide and suggesting that your life is property that you hold at the will of God. It is not yours. It is not absolute. So from Locke's perspective then, life and liberty all tend to focus around the issue of property. Liberty is the freedom to acquire property. Life is the gift from God, the property that you hold from God. Natural rights philosophers, of course, want the same definitions or the same meanings that existed with Locke to fall naturally under Jefferson's use of the term unalienable. That creates a problem. And I would suggest to you it's a problem that the natural rights philosophers have not as yet successfully been able to deal with. And that is that private property, by definition, is not unalienable, it is alienable. And if you look up the meaning of alienable, property is usually provided as the best example of what the meaning of alienable is about. As a commodity, as an entity, as something tangible that you own with a deed or some sort of certification that this is yours. By definition, property is alienable. What does alienable mean? It means transferable. It means that it is a commodity, and as such, it can be assigned value. It can be inherited. It can be sold. It can be taxed. It is a commodity, an entity. If you go back and you read Locke carefully about man's exit from the state of nature and his creation of government to protect his natural rights to life, liberty, and property, even Locke makes the case that property, once it is owned by a human being, by man, changes its status from unalienable to alienable, from a natural right to an alienable commodity. In effect, what I'm suggesting is that if you read the philosophy of John Locke, you begin to recognize that property as a commodity does not exist in Locke's state of nature. What exists in the state of nature is what Locke calls the commons. The resources that exist in the state of nature do not belong to individual men, but rather to man in general. The commons belongs to everybody. But Locke indeed does acknowledge the reality of private ownership. And he does lay out an explanation within the second treatise about the process man must go through in order to lay claim to a piece of property by mixing his labor with it. And Locke's analysis suggests that if you work on it, if you work the land, if you cultivate it, if you clear the land and clear the forest, then the mere fact that you have mixed your labor with that portion of the commons, you have in effect established the right to claim that as your own. It is my sense, my reading of Locke, that when that happens, property as we know it, namely as an alienable commodity, comes into existence. It doesn't exist so long as it continues to be part of the commons. Property only comes into existence when it becomes privately owned. Locke recognizes this because Locke is very aware that all men in the state of nature have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Not just a few, everybody. Consequently, Locke is very insistent that your right to claim a piece of the commons as your own is legitimate, is possible, but only within certain carefully defined parameters. Locke recognizes that when you claim ownership of a piece of the commons, that means that you have the right to exclude others from it. You have the right to fence it in, for example. And Locke makes very clearly the point that your right to claim private property is contingent on the fact that there remains sufficient property available for others, because all men have the right to property. Therefore, Locke says, you are limited to the amount of property that you can claim. You are not allowed to claim, Locke says, more than you can use, more than you need. Because if you're allowed to do that, then your private property is taken at the expense of the rights of others to secure property for themselves. So Locke's second treatise makes the point that your ownership of private property is contingent on the fact, and this is a quote from Locke, that there is enough and as good left in common for others, unquote. There is enough and as good left in common for others. You can't take all the best property. You can't take all the property that has water on it. You can't take all the property with the timber and leave less than equal property for others to fight over. So consequently, Locke believes that there are limits. There are regulations associated with your rights within the state of nature to claim a portion of the commons as your own. Therefore, when man decides by the use of reason to leave the state of nature, move into society, create an organized society with its own government for the purposes of protecting your private property, what he is talking about, it seems to me, is the right of man to access property. The fact that there are limitations on the ownership of private property in the state of nature suggests to me that it is inconceivable that those limitations on the private ownership of property cease to exist when man creates government. If government's job is to protect man's natural rights are to pursue the ownership of property. But once property becomes a commodity, it seems to me, government's job is to make sure that the public interest is protected. Just as there is a public interest that exists within the state of nature. If there wasn't, then Locke wouldn't have put restrictions on how much property you can own. By the mere fact that Locke establishes limits to the amount of property you can own, namely, the only property you can own is the property you can mix your labor with and that meets your needs. You are not allowed to accumulate property that you don't need at the expense of other people's rights to have access to it. That exists in the state of nature. Locke says that the law that exists in the state of nature is reason, common sense. It seems to me if reason and common sense in the state of nature dictates that there must be restrictions on the amount of property you can own, then it stands to reason that the transition from the state of nature to organized society and the decision to live under government that receives its right to govern from the consent of the governed, and the right to govern being defined as the right to protect man's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The word pursuit suggests access, the right to own. It is a right. It is an abstract right. It is tied directly to your freedom. If you do not have the right to pursue property or pursue happiness, then your freedom is meaningless. Your liberty is meaningless. So it seems to me that what Locke is talking about here is government's responsibility to protect man's freedom to pursue. What the natural rights philosophers are talking about is government's responsibility to protect property once it becomes a commodity. Not only that, but they argue that man's freedom means that there are no limits to the amount of property he can own. In effect, what is it we're saying here? It seems to me that what we're saying is that there's a difference of opinion between the natural rights philosophy and others over the issue of what government's principal responsibility is. Is government's principal responsibility to protect property as a commodity that is owned by individuals, and along with that, to protect man's freedom to accumulate as much property, as much wealth as he is able to accumulate? That's the philosophy of the natural rights philosophers. That's the philosophy which drives free enterprise capitalism. The pursuit of individual self-interest is the ultimate freedom that government must protect. But on the other hand, there's another argument. And that is, if John Locke established parameters, limitations, governing the amount of property that one person could control in the state of nature, and it was reason or common sense that dictated that, then by definition it's common sense based on the idea that if you allow man to accumulate more property than he can use, you are limiting the abilities of other people to have access to property. By definition, the commons shrinks. The opportunities for others disappear as individuals control more and more and more. Not what they need, just what they want. Locke says common sense or reason in the state of nature forbids that. Why in hell would it be allowed after the social contract, after man leaves the state of nature? It doesn't make sense. It violates reason. It's contradictory to reason. If reason tells you one thing in the state of nature, why does reason change once you leave the state of nature? And government's responsibility from then on is to protect the property of those who own it and the freedom of those who own it to acquire more and more and more, as if it were a natural right. In effect, their property is alienable. It can be sold. It can be taxed. It can be assigned a value, a set value. It can be quantified. It can be measured. It's susceptible to mathematics. It's a thing. It's not a right, it's a thing. It is no longer unalienable. The right to pursue property is unalienable. Government's need or responsibility to protect man's freedom to pursue his own self-interest, if you will, within the accepted bounds of the society, within the rules by which society has agreed to live, that is an unalienable right. That government has a responsibility to protect. But to protect the commodity that is owned by individual people, and to protect their freedom to accumulate more and more and more at the expense of what's available for others, I would suggest to you that violates common sense. It violates reason. And John Locke was insistent that reason is the law of nature. It's based on the assumption. The law of nature is, or the state of nature is based on the assumption that reasonable thinking people can recognize that there are certain acceptable behaviors and certain unacceptable behaviors, and that man's common sense would tell him what they are. The purpose of government is to enforce the law of nature against those who choose to not abide by it. By definition, Locke is implying that man's reason and that man's common sense is not left within the state of nature, but it goes with man into society. And the same factors that limited and affected the accumulation of property in the state of nature, it seems to me, ought logically to apply in society as well. And what that means to me is government's principal priority is to protect the public interest, the rights of all citizens to pursue happiness, not to protect their accumulation once they attain it. Property, it seems to me, changes its status with the decision to leave the state of nature and move into organized society and subject oneself to the social contract. By definition, you agree to abide by the rules of the society in which you live. And no society, it seems to me, common sense, would set out with the idea that those who are able to can accumulate as much as they can, and that everybody else is left to fend for themselves as the pie continues to shrink. That violates all sense of common decency and reason, it seems to me. To argue that Locke would defend that, I'm convinced, is dishonest. It's a stretch. It's out and out dishonest. But again, going back to our opening comment in yesterday's program, and this was the theme. The fact that Carl Becker's study of the Declaration of Independence, published in 1922, definitively established the link between Jefferson and John Locke, meant that the definitive nature of Carl Becker's study defined the meaning of the Declaration from that time forward. It dictated the way man reads the Declaration. So the fact of the matter is, what Carl Becker was able to do is to establish the fact that that one paragraph, the paragraph focused on the philosophy of the Declaration early in the document, is the document. And that everything else in the Declaration of Independence is rendered secondary to that. The reality is that's not historically valid. That's not what Jefferson intended. That's not what the Congress intended that voted to approve independence. To them, the focus of the Declaration was the justification for independence contained in the charges against the mother country and the clear indication that they violated the self-evident truths of that period, which Jefferson articulated in a very short paragraph. To assume that that paragraph is the entire document and that its intent was to establish a creed and a principle by which government was to function from then on is a real stretch. And it's in that context, then, that the natural rights philosophers want the Constitution of the United States to be considered and to be viewed. As a frame of government designed principally to bring about the philosophy of the Declaration, which Carl Becker defines as a limited government with responsibilities to protect man's unalienable rights, among which is private property, and that therefore government's role is minimal, government size needs to be kept small, government's powers need to be controlled, the amount of freedom and independence and flexibility that government has must constantly be limited and constantly regulated at all times, because the ultimate freedom, the ultimate goal of the Declaration of Independence, of this creed, is the individual freedom to pursue one's sense of self-interest, a freedom which government must continually protect. It renders government from defender of the public interest and promoter of the public interest to the role of servant of the few. It implies a definition of government as the agent of the propertied, as the agent of the wealthy, and thereby it suggests that those with the most wealth are the most important citizens in this society, which violates the whole idea of equality as articulated by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence in that same paragraph. These people don't like to deal with equality. They are much more comfortable dealing with inequality. Equality is opportunity. Freedom of opportunity. John Locke told us that the uncontrolled accumulation of private property limits opportunity. Therefore, government cannot allow it. Government must have the right to regulate alienable property. It is a commodity. It is a thing. It is a value. And to assume that government has no right to touch it because it's unalienable or no right to regulate it means that government has no right to govern in the public interest, but rather must continually limit or define its own job to the role of protecting the private property of the few. That is not what Jefferson intended. That is not what the founders intended. That is not what the Continental Congress wanted or agreed to when they approved the Declaration of Independence. And that is not what drove Madison, Hamilton, and the rest of them to write the Constitution of the United States. I think all of this speaks to the danger of creed. The danger of the idea that certain ideas or certain principles are so fixed and so absolute that they are beyond question. They become absolute truth. And it's the nature of a definitive study that renders them to be truth. The very definition of Becker's Declaration of Independence as the definitive study of the Declaration of Independence means that its conclusions and its theories are unchallenged, absolute truth, and are not to be questioned. In light of the agenda of contemporary wealth of corporate America, of the wealthiest 1%, if you will, it's obvious that they are very comfortable with this interpretation of the Declaration and this definition of the role for government. And this really helps us understand, I believe, what some of the major controversies that are existing in today's debates, in today's struggles, party struggles within Washington, the dysfunction that exists between liberals and conservatives, between Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C., the inability of government to govern, the dysfunction that has become pervasive, where one side is so determined to have its way that it is literally willing to shut down government and prevent it from governing. So insistent and so sure are these people that their interpretation of the past and interpretation of the founders is true. It seems to me that this is extremely significant. But again, as I mentioned on the Facebook page before we went on the air today, today's program really should focus and is intended to focus not on the Declaration, but on the Constitution. If Carl Becker's study of the Declaration is definitive, then I apologize for the phone. I have no idea who it would be. Just please ignore the ring. I don't intend to answer it. When I made the presentation last Thursday night at Concord University in celebration of Constitution Day, I began my presentation with the equation which suggested that Carl Becker is to the Declaration of Independence as Charles Beard is to the Constitution of the United States. And what I was suggesting is that as definitive as Becker's study of the Declaration of Independence has become, so also has Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution become the definitive reading of the Federalist Papers, become the definitive explanation as to what the Constitution of the United States was all about. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail over the issue of definitive and the nature or the meaning of something of a particular study that is definitive, because I think we beat that one to death with Carl Becker. But I'm asking you to transfer the symbols and transfer the meaning directly to Charles Beard, and to recognize that as definitive as Becker is for the Declaration, so Beard is to the Constitution of the United States. Let me clarify this with one explanation, because I think it's important. Many people in this country were not comfortable with and do not appreciate Beard's economic interpretation. And after we take our break and enter our second hour today, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. But the fact of the matter is, while a lot of people are comfortable with the Carl Becker approach to the Declaration, a lot of people are uncomfortable with Charles Beard and the Constitution. But the irony is that doesn't deny the significance of definitive. Because there are many who do subscribe to Charles Beard's economic interpretation. And while there are many who don't, and while there are many who take issue with it, and while there are many who have spent their careers and their lives on the quest, on the mission to refute Beard, the fact of the matter is nobody has been able to quite do that. So the fact of the matter is, when we say it is definitive, what we're saying is it doesn't matter whether you like it or don't like it. You got to deal with it. The people that hate it can't ignore it because it's too powerful. It's too real. There's too much evidence to support it, or at least a portion of it. And there's absolutely no question that the founders themselves contributed to this. Hamilton and Madison in the Federalist Papers acknowledge over and over again that self-interest drives faction. And faction, which is organized self-interest, organized power, organized interest groups, are the greatest threat and have already always been the greatest threat to popular governments throughout history, Madison says in Federalist number 10. What Madison is saying is there's absolutely no question that self-interest and man's common sense, man's ability to reason, and his willingness to seek out and unite and organize with others who have a like self-interest, recognizing that organized power has a better chance of being successful than each man fending for himself. As long as that reality exists, Madison says, and as long as man is free to exercise it, as long as man is free to do that, then whatever kind of government we set up has to deal with the reality that self-interest is an important factor that you can't overlook, that you can't deny. So what Madison says in Federalist number 10 then is that the major job of the convention, the major challenge of the Constitution, is to preserve popular government and at the same time control the violence of faction. Control the ability of factions to get power. And the entire document is Madison's efforts to address those two objectives, which seem to be mutually contradictory. They seem to be contradictory to each other. If self-interest drives individuals, and if man's freedom cannot be tampered with, then by definition, self-interest is going to become a factor in politics, in government. And somehow, Madison says, we've got to structure government in such a way that the realities of self-interest never are allowed to exercise power at the expense of others. And it's very logical to Madison. It makes perfect sense to Madison that the principal issue associated with self-interest is property, wealth. So therefore, if people are free to exercise their self-interest, then what they are after is property. What they are after is wealth, success. Madison says factions are sown into the nature of man. This self-interested drive is innate. It's genetic. It's there with everybody. And if you are going to respect man's freedom and never tamper with man's freedom, then you have to conclude that somehow you're going to have to deal with this. But here's where the divergence comes. Because the difference between the two, the difference here is the matter of public interest. If self-interest is allowed to dominate, then it dominates at the expense of the public interest. It permits the few to dominate the many. It permits the few to dominate government. And thereby it denies government the authority and the power it needs to govern in the public interest. So that contradiction is what Madison takes on in Federalist Number 10. The need to control self-interest, and at the same time the need to promote the public interest. And that's what Federalist 10, as we've looked at here at the Virtual Center over and over again, is about. We've gone beyond the top of our hour, so let's pause and take a 5-minute break. We're about 3 minutes after, actually 4 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause for 5 minutes and take a break, and then we'll come back, and that'll give us the better part of a full hour to look at and to consider the contributions of Charles Beard and his economic interpretation of the Constitution, and the extent to which its definitive nature continues to dictate and dominate the society in which we all live. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. I know that Bob has some music to entertain us. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour on this Wednesday.
And, Bill, I thought I would mention you have Horzak with you. Horst.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, you have Horst with you.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Hey, I see I see this delightful image on the screen. Thank you, Bob. Horst, how are you?
Hi, Dr. Bill. Do you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. Thank you. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I have to check with the audio quality because I'm getting a little bit of cutting out from your side over here. So.
Oh, okay.
And if it gets to be too much of an issue, we can try it some other time. But for now, if you can hear me, that's good enough, I guess.
I can hear you now pretty well. I wanted to tell you that I did get your email, but I didn't see it until about an hour before the program, and I didn't take the time because I figured that there wasn't really much I could do with that little time. So I wanted to. So I didn't really get a chance to look at what you had said. I just knew that I had received an email from you.
Okay, well, that's good enough. It turned out to be a good deal longer than I expected. I was at work today listening to the podcast from yesterday's program, and about 30 minutes in there, I just suddenly got a bolt out of the blue, and I did my best to hammer it out in writing and get it to you, with enough time to go before the show started, but just couldn't quite get it done. And then it turned out to be about 6 or 7 pages, so I don't know. It could be anywhere from 12 to 1,500 words. I'm not really sure. But
yeah,
the funny thing
when I saw the length of it, I figured, oh, Bill, I better hold this until after the program, and maybe I can address it in the early next week.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is like a good deal of what you've been discussing, like in the last hour, is more or less right in line with what I was saying anyhow. So it's just kind of funny. It was probably one of those situations where I probably was kind of cluing into the direction you were going with it yesterday, and just kind of naturally picked it up and sent it in there. But real briefly, I can kind of summarize a couple of points.
Go right ahead.
And the main thing is that what occurred to me is that just a couple of really big contradictions in the whole natural rights philosophy thing, at least insofar as I was able to understand what it's about from your discussion of it. I mean, like I haven't read any original or source documents or any of the books involved, so I couldn't really address them on their own territory. But just one of the things that, if the Constitution is based on the Declaration or the creed established by the Declaration, and if the creed is all about unalienable rights, then to me right there the game's already over, because there are no unalienable rights in the Constitution. Right. I mean, if you look at it, the first of these is the right to life. Well, that's out the window, because in the Constitution it stipulates directly that there's a death penalty for the crime of treason. There you go. That's about as alienable as it gets,
And the Due Process Clause suggests that life is not unalienable. It can be taken away provided that the accused is awarded due process, which means you go through a proper legal procedure, which is justified by the jurists in the society, and laid out exactly what you must do in order to guarantee due process to the accused. And if you do that, if you go through that procedure, then life ceases to be absolute, and society, establishes the right to take life. And that's a violation of Locke, because Locke's argument is nobody has a right to take life. So.
Yeah. I didn't quite catch all of that.
Well, that's okay. That's all right.
Well, due process, and again, the whole justice system, even just the rudimentary sketches, in the Constitution, again, your liberty is highly subject to alienation, or however, whatever you want to call that. I mean, it can be taken away from you and curtailed or just canceled altogether. And property, I mean, what does that even mean, say the right to property? It sounds like when you're born, you get property. And I had to, that's one of the things that slowed me down today, is I had to go back and look up, the actual, what Locke actually said, because I thought it probably wasn't as simple as life, liberty, and property, and actually it isn't. I guess that's that's an abbreviated shorthand that people use for convenience. His argument for property actually is a more drawn out thing that has to be kind of condensed. But I guess essentially what he's saying is, your property is your body, and then whatever you can put together using it, from your labor, is also yours too. And then it kind of builds from there. Mm-hmm. But one thing I was going to ask you about is, where was Locke on inheritable property, like passing from one generation to another? I mean, I assume that he would have been okay with taking anything that you give, that you make for yourself and giving it to someone else while you're alive. But I just wondered if you had actually said anything about inheritance as such, because that seems to have like really huge implications on property rights too.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not going to guess what's in there, and I can't. I'm trying to remember if I've run across places in Locke where he talks about inheritable property, because by definition that means it's a commodity. And the only thing I remember is that the whole context of the second treatise was to justify limits to government. I mean, Locke's whole intent, political intent behind the second treatise is to challenge the absolute power of the English king, and to legitimize the right of Parliament as representative of the people of the nation to participate in governance. And that means that Locke had to challenge the absolute claim to power of the king, the whole idea of the divine right of kings. And that was really the political context. And of course, the constituency that Locke was defending, which was Parliament, was principally controlled by the emerging middle classes, by the business community, by merchants and bankers and investors and shipbuilders, and in other words, the group that really supports Locke's challenge to the absolute rights of the king is the group that is claiming the right to participate in exercise of power. And up until this point, decisions pretty much were in the hands of the king, along with the landed nobility that supported him. And the civil wars that are happening in England at the time are efforts of the middle class as the most dynamic element within English society to participate in decision-making, in governance. And what Locke's second treatise is the philosophical justification for limits to absolute power and the right of Parliament to participate in the governance of the nation. And that's where this whole idea of consent to the governed and all of this comes from. He's basically trying to legitimize the access to power for Parliament. And so within that, I guess what I'm saying is those that he represents and speaks for are those who would be very, very supportive and protective of property. But it would be a different kind of property. It would be property that is invested. In other words, one of the things that, and this is kind of another topic, but one of the things that's involved with all of this is the very changing nature of property itself. In medieval England, for example, property was land.
Yeah.
And it was not a commodity. It was not something, I mean, the whole idea is that your status as a human being and your standing in society was determined and defined by the property you held. And so property was never... I remember you discussing
this before, right? You said that property was not to be bought or sold.
No, it wasn't to be sold. It was a contributing factor to your status as a person. And the definition of property that is most driving Parliament is a different kind of property. It's the kind of property associated with capitalism, the kind of property that you buy and sell and trade and invest and all of these other things. So the nature of property itself is changing. And these are the people who are literally supporting Locke's second treatise. So that's the context of this. So the point I'm trying to make is that the very people who support Locke are the people who would support the idea of property as a commodity. in the medieval period, in England of the past, so to speak, which is represented by the landed nobility, those that own the largest estates in England. This is a definition of property that they refuse to accept, and that really is part of the struggle that constitutes the civil wars that are going on in England. Is many historians who write about this talk about the civil wars as being really the epitome of the transition from the England of the past to England of the future. That the emergence of the middle class signals a total change in the meaning of property and in the role of property and in the whole issue of power and the role of property in the governance of the nation and all of this. In other words, this is symbolic of the major changes from the medieval period into the modern period that England is going through. And
it's interesting to note that at the same sorry. It's just interesting to note that at the same time you're having a similar shift of power taking place between the monarchy and Parliament.
Yes.
And all of this is happening right in the period of time right before the Industrial Revolution, which I mean there's almost just a flow to it. When you step back far enough and
there sure is.
It's pretty incredible.
And of course, this takes a lot longer to unfold in England than it does in the United States. In the United States, it all happens in the late 19th century after the Civil War. All of that process is compressed into the 35 years from 1865, the end of the war. I mean, that's right. When the Industrial Revolution really takes off in the United States. And the interpretation of the Constitution is the same interpretation of limits on government's right to interfere that Locke is making in the 17th century against government's right to absolute power. And what you're basically doing is opening up society to the realities of an emerging commercial capitalism. And at this time, it's predominantly commercial. There's no industrial yet. But in the 18th century, industrialism begins to happen. And manufacturing starts to happen, and then you get into the early 19th century, and that's when the evils of the factory system and all of that, what Charles Dickens writes about, occur. So it's a fascinating subject. But again, I don't mean to divert attention from the point you were making, which is the whole issue of Locke and inheritable property. I can't point to a particular place in Locke where he talks about this, but at the same time, I know that the people that he is writing to support are people who are advocating or endorsing a much broader interpretation of the meaning of property as commodity from what had gone before. So I really think that Locke is the philosopher of the future, so to speak, in many ways. And of course, the situation there mirrors so closely the arguments that the colonies are trying to make against the mother country that Locke becomes, very, very, very attractive. And that's, obviously why people assume that Jefferson's entire declaration is taken directly from Locke. But the fact of the matter is, there's much more going on in Europe and in England, in the British, the island of Britain, and that's the Scottish philosophical school, which is looking at the Enlightenment in a totally different and expanded way. And Jefferson becomes immersed in that. And that's the issue, it seems to me. In other words, it seems to me the issue is not so much Jefferson. The issue is what people in contemporary politics seek to do with Jefferson in order to use him to justify what they want. And I think that's the message. So at least that's one of the messages. And that's what's happening with Beard and the Constitution as well, I think.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
As far as my point on Locke, it's almost not even really important. I mean,
it is.
it doesn't. It is, but like not to the actual point that it just to address the natural rights philosophy crowd. Really, you don't have to scratch them too deep to see that there's some really fundamental misreadings of Locke. Not even that far under the surface. It's pretty much right out there. I mean, like if you just read the second treatise from start to finish, probably you would see all the problems with it. Mm-hmm. But what occurred to me is if you just take them and their assumptions as written and then go through the logic of it, it just falls apart. I mean, like it's like a big sweater with a big old thread hanging off of it. You just tug it and the whole thing falls apart. And what occurred to me specifically is again just the language of the so-called unalienable rights. And what I wrote to you and like the basic of what I'm getting at here is like, let's just say, okay, they're right. Jefferson really wanted to say life, liberty, property, but he didn't think he could get away with it for whatever reason, so he changed it to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Okay, fine. We'll take that as a given, and let's move forward and say, on top of that when Locke said life, liberty, and property, he really did mean the unlimited acquisition of personal property is a right too. So okay. And then, really, what happens is as you look at it, you have to say, well, how is? And again, sorry, losing my voice here.
Well, that's okay. You're breaking up a little bit, but we're still able to stay with you.
Okay. Well, I'll try to take it slow and hope the connection holds up.
Okay.
Well, ultimately, anyway, if you follow their logic, you get to a point where really the rights, the unalienable rights, life, liberty, and acquisition, unlimited acquisition of property, are not equal rights. Because what happens is property, the more property you accumulate, the more and more important it becomes, and the more it becomes the dominant right, the primary right, and everything else is subservient and subsequent to it, to the point that your right to life. Well, what do we mean by the right to life? I mean, is it just like you have a right to be born and then you're on your own? Or does it mean you have the right to actually live? And that means, have food and water and a place and shelter and clothing if you need it, and access to medical care and all the things that right now in our current system of government under the Constitution, at least the way it's shaped up, is all, apportioned out according to how much, how much you can pay for it, or whether and if you can. And there's a bit of a social safety net, but it's shrinking fast. It's not what it was even 15, 20 years ago. And at the rate it's going, there won't be anything left of it hardly. So that's just one. Liberty, of course, we've been over that. Again, the more money you have, the more free time you have, and the more say you have over how you spend it. And that really is, what does freedom mean if you're only basically free to work, your life away, making money for someone else?
Right.
For one example, or on the other hand, you could look at it this way. You could say like, well, if I have a whole lot of money, that increases the likelihood that I commit any crime I want to and still walk away from it without any punishment or without any significant, consequences or curtailment of my liberties. So again, and we all know that access to the entire justice system, let's not, just setting aside the questions of incarceration, but like any kind of penalties, those kinds of things go away for the most part, or to the degree that you can pay someone to take care of it for you. So here again, money gets more and more important the more and more of it you have, and this is where the inheritance portion of it comes into effect. Because at that point, if you amass a lot of material possessions and you pass it on to your progeny, then they are born with a great deal of wealth, where most people in this country and in this world are born without any at all, or very, very little. And so you close the loop and you go around to the beginning. You get to the beginning of this. All men are not created equal. They're not even created equal, because some are born with wealth, And right there, you've already got more. If you have it, you've got more rights than everybody else. And if you haven't got any of it, then you effectively don't have any rights at all.
I see what you're saying.
And so if you just... And it's interesting, earlier you were talking about the social contract, because that's basically what any government is. Any government implies a social contract. Here are the rules. The governors, have their particular obligations, and the governed have their obligations. And if everyone does their part, then you get to have these rights and privileges, or whatever. I mean, not every system of government is voluntary by any means, but the American Constitution was kind of predicated on the fact that the consent of the governed is in there. I mean, at least at the time of ratification. So, but there's a social contract, and the way I've always understood it, and I think you were implying the same thing, is basically you get to enjoy your rights up to and until you harm or damage or infringe upon the rights of your fellow citizens. And then depending on how far you go, then you begin to lose your rights until you can either be incarcerated, have your property confiscated, or if we just have to, you might have to die. So anyone to the degree that you once you step outside of the social contract, you are an outlaw. You are outside the law, and you are in a zone where you do not enjoy the protections or any guarantees. Anything can happen to you. Doesn't mean it necessarily will, but it can, and you put yourself in that position. So, in a sense, you could say, all right, if the Declaration sets up a creed that the Constitution enforces or manifests or embodies or in some way structures and brings into being, then it has to be conditional. It has to be based on the stipulation that you're abiding by this group agreement, we the people, So it's not, your rights are not unalienable, but in a sense, they are alienable ultimately by your decision to abide by or not the social contract implied. And again, as you and I understand it, that means play by the rules and you'll be okay. And the rules are...
That's right.
You can look at it two ways, and this is something I wrote in the email. It's you have the libertarian view, which is lately I hear it called the silver rule, which is don't treat others in a manner that you would not want to be treated in, as opposed to the golden rule, which we've all heard of, which is a positive statement saying treat people the way that you want to be treated.
Right.
And it sounds like a distinction without a difference, but there actually is kind of an important separation there. And as I wrote, the silver rule is kind of a libertarian philosophy, whereas the golden rule is more of a Scottish Enlightenment, pursuit of happiness kind of thing.
Exactly.
It requires
it implies some responsibility.
It requires engagement.
Right.
Right.
Right. Boy, I'll tell you, that's a tremendous distinction. That's a tremendously important distinction that you make between the golden rule and the idea of treating others the way you would be treated, and there's quite a difference. And because the golden rule assesses some sort of moral responsibility on individuals for the welfare of other individuals.
Right. Well, there's a mutual benefit involved in it.
Right.
Whereas if it's just like a non-aggression pact, then you can completely withdraw and disengage from society if that's what you want. And in fact, it's kind of implied. You stay out of each other's way to the extent possible. Okay. Well,
which of those two?
We can debate which one is better or which is more desirable. But the point.
Well, I was going to say, which one of those would you figure is closest to Locke?
Well, without having actually read too much of Locke directly, I've never read the second treatise. I mean, I went and did a little about 10 minutes worth of web research today just to kind of figure out where it was with the property thing, and I was able to read a couple of excerpts that drafted. Okay, you're born with your body. It's yours because clearly it doesn't belong to anybody else. So that's your property. And then what you take and you do it. And so I was able to follow that and kind of extrapolate a kind of a big picture argument of like, okay, where he's going with this and how this is being, put to service in the service of the natural rights crowd. And I accidentally stumbled across one of their websites for a minute, and that was kind of fun for about 20 seconds. And I had to I had to move on because I was running out of time. But the point about the silver rule or golden rule, whichever way you want to, okay, we could debate about which one of these agreements underlies the American Constitution, or neither. But I mean, like, I'm just saying, like, my understanding, since I've been aware that such a thing as a social contract exists or was thought to exist, was one of those two formulations. It's something to the effect that you don't hurt each other, and if you really want to do something nice, then that's good too. You can help each other out and you kind of pick and choose like how you feel about it at any given point in time. But the important thing is, if you go to the natural rights group and you go to a system in which property rights are dominant over all other rights, then what they are doing there, whether they're doing it consciously or intentionally, they are rewriting the social contract to something that says something completely different. And the way I had it formulated was, all men are created equal, and then they acquire property. And then you have unalienable rights. You have the right to life, to the extent that you can pay to maintain it. You have the right to liberty, to the extent that you have money to enjoy it. And you have the right to the acquisition of property, to the extent that you already have property and can hang on to it, essentially. Right. Everything comes with the addendum, as long as you can afford it, or to the degree that you can afford it. And that's,
it's interesting.
That's the natural rights philosophy. That's their social contract that they're promoting.
Right. And, it's interesting because in Locke, and I recall, I hadn't thought of this for a long time, but there is in Locke a passage where he addresses the question about what rights do people without property have in the state of nature. And Locke's answer is, you have the right to breathe the air and move freely throughout the land while you pursue property. And that's the limit. You are free to pursue property, but until you acquire it, you really don't have rights. That property rights are directly connected to the ownership of property. And so if you take that for what it's worth and take it out of that context and put it in today, then the implication is that the poor really have no rights at all. And it's fascinating to play with these ideas and apply them to real life situations, whether it's in today's world or yesterday's world or whatever. But he does pose that issue about what, if the whole idea of pursuit of property, what it's all about, what natural rights do people without property own? And his argument is the freedom to move around, which means access to the commons. You have access to what everybody else has access to. But that your rights under government are directly linked to the ownership of property. If you don't have property, you don't have rights. All you have is the right to pursue property. I mean, and I think that's probably what people like the folks that you're talking about in the old natural rights idea would basically say. That's my conclusion, is that would be the direction that they would go in. Because they believe that the pursuit of property is really what life is all about. I mean, it's really interesting. But again, I wouldn't want to demean the natural rights philosophers, because the depth of analysis that they engage in, and they go all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans, and it's fascinating. I mean, it is fascinating, the depth with which they go. And the whole idea is to is to legitimize the idea of natural rights and relate it to government's principal responsibility is to protect them. But the key factor, it seems to me, is the inclusion of property amongst those natural rights. And I think
for my way of thinking, if we went with property as a right in itself, I don't think I would have a problem with that. I mean, like we've discussed this, it's been quite a while, but like I made a point a while back in a previous call that you do actually, if you're going to live, you have to have a place to do it. And you know, Locke makes allowances for this in his concept of the commons, I suppose. I don't know exactly what his formulation of that is. I would like to read more about it.
Yeah.
But if there is property that the citizenry hold in common, then that means, if nothing else, even if you don't have your own discrete piece of land that you can go to and call your own, you can there at least is some place in the nation where you're allowed to be and someone can't chase you out. I mean, because this is an issue that we see a lot increasingly, you know, as homeless populations are being pushed around and moved around, and like, you know, essentially we have a class of illegal people in the country, depending on, you know, what state they live in and what city in some cases. I mean, there was a story a few years ago, for instance, about how, you know, in the state of Florida or one of the cities, they had made it illegal to give food to homeless people in public parks. Mm-hmm. You know, they're just some people would pull up a van on Sundays or whatever, and they'd hand out sandwiches to homeless people. And, you know, someone in I can't remember what city this is. This was a fairly famous story a couple of years ago, but you know, there were city ordinances passed against it, outlawing it, and, you know, a couple of people went to jail over it.
Yeah.
For giving food to people. This is not even that's not even to mention, like, you know, if a homeless person sleeps on a park bench and they're either arrested or run off or something like that. And that's not universally true. This is up to individual municipalities, but still, it's that same problem. These are people with absolutely dispossessed of anything except whatever they've got on their physical person. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you're not lucky, and there's not some charitable organization that will put you up. It's as though your existence is to some extent illegal.
Yeah.
And that's crazy.
I agree. I agree. You know, the interesting thing is, though, if you look at community, at the origins of community, it seems to me that, from what I've read, that it's Christianity that changes the definition of charity. The whole idea prior to the emergence of Christianity was that as a member of the community, you were entitled to certain rights. And the community's responsibility was to make sure that those rights were fulfilled, that those needs were fulfilled. And so, in essence, charity was not something that an individual makes a conscious decision to give to those without, but that, in effect, what is being given to those without is the right of those people as a member of the community. And Christianity changes that by emphasizing the idea of giving to those in need, and the idea that your soul, you know, that your goodness is enhanced by your willingness to give to others. And it shifts the responsibility or the emphasis from the receiver to the giver. But prior to this time, the idea was that as a member of the community, you were entitled to certain things. I mean, today we would say that as a member of society, you have a right to an education, you have a right to a roof over your head, you have a right to a job, you have a right to health care. I mean, these are not things that society chooses to give or not give. That these are the rights of people who who live in your community. And we reject that. Because that is totally alien to the idea of capitalism, and to the idea of self-interest and accumulation and all the rest of it. But, I was fascinated by that, because I had never encountered that until maybe within the last year or so. I ran across that, and I found that fascinating. But the issue
I was just
you
thinking,
make
every time this subject comes up, it takes me back to Plato's Republic, for instance. I mean, I can't remember the name of the character. I always thought it was Thrasymachus or Thrasymachus, but I keep, every time I look it up, it turns out to be the wrong one. But if you remember the setup to the Republic, before Socrates gets underway with his discussion of the ideal state, there's a very long argument in the beginning between him and a student over what the nature or what the definition of virtue is. Mm-hmm. And the student's contention is that if you're virtuous, then you're basically setting yourself up to be taken advantage of. Whereas Socrates' contention is that virtue is its own reward, and to me, that's basically it. That tension has been with us in Western society ever since, and it's capitalism versus the Scottish Enlightenment pursuit of happiness today.
Right.
It's something. It's either outwardly oriented or inwardly oriented, and that argument has been taking place ever since the written word.
Yeah. Good, the whole idea, good people. I mean, my wife and I have this discussion all the time. She basically believes that, that good people by definition are setting themselves up to be taken advantage of. And that you gotta be suspicious of everybody, and you gotta basically, be on your guard all the time. And my position has always been, until somebody wrongs me, I will assume that they won't. And so I'm willing to be had, I guess, one time, and so, and it's a difference that we have between us. And I said, I'll sometimes say to her, that's an awful sad way to live, if you think about it, where you don't trust anybody, That
reminds me of that famous quote from the German visitor to America was someone asked him, you pay so many taxes in Germany. He said, but you're a wealthy person or something. He said, well, I would much rather live in a country that's supported by I'm paraphrasing, but he said I'd much rather pay extra taxes and live in a nice country with nice things like roads and infrastructure than live in a country where I get to keep more of my money but everything is crummy.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's a similar argument. As long as enough people take it upon themselves to assume that they're going to be treated well and just operate in kind of a good faith sort of way, then society can carry on. Yes. In a relatively comfortable fashion. But when everyone contracts into themselves and starts watching out for their own interest, then you hit a tipping point that way too, and then suddenly everything gets scary and dark and dangerous. And
we kind of going back to Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, aren't we?
Well, there's really nowhere you can go to get away from it. I mean, it's
unbelievable. Yeah, exactly. And what your the inclination of those two ideal states is, where the inclination in one is to trust your fellow man, and the inclination in the other is to not to, but always look out for your own best interest, because nobody else is, and everybody else is going to try to take advantage of you. And so therefore you always got to be on your toes for that. And I mean, you're right. It just goes on and on. It's different words and different contexts, but it's the same issue over and over again.
And one final area of application, again, this is another thing that keeps occurring to me is, the American two-party system of government is subject to the same good faith assumption of good faith. We're in a completely dysfunctional place right now because the emphasis has shifted from getting something done to accumulating power at whatever cost. And anywhere you look today, you can find an example of this dynamic at work, and generally speaking, going wrong.
I
guess there's a pendulum on it.
Where I think we need to go here at the Virtual Center is in the direction of this very idea about the two-party system, because I think that's where we're headed. Because Madison is instrumental in the creation of the two-party system. I mean, he is absolutely he's got his thumb on all of it. He is causing all of it. And in the 90s, the organization of the Jeffersonian Opposition Party to the Hamilton Federalist Party in the administration of Washington, and especially in the administration of John Adams in the end of the 1790s. And many historians have pointed out how inconsistent this is in Madison. And that here's Madison talking about in 51 about the way you set up the structure and the way you use challenge to offset or to counter ambition, to counter ambition, and all the rest of it. And then here he sets out to organize an opposition party when the whole idea of party is so anathema to Washington. I mean, you read Washington's farewell address, and half of it is directed against the emergence of parties, which seems to be happening. He's afraid it's because what he sees in party is polarization. And what Madison sees is the opportunity to turn that from a negative into a positive. But what you point out today that's going on in Washington, obviously, is polarization has gone to the extreme, where the two sides are become totally dysfunctional and unable to work together. So in a sense, we broke the system that Madison created, I believe. Or we are in the process of breaking it. But,
well, and I have to point out, I don't blame both sides even nearly the same. I think this is basically a situation created by one side, and the other side, in order to not be just completely annihilated, has to adopt some of the same tactics, because it's a defensive move. I mean, you may not be able to fight fire with fire, but you got to do something, or you can get burned real quick.
If one side remains noble and the other side is not, then the outcome is a given. And so the question is,
two-party politics becomes a game of the Spanish prisoner.
Do you bring your competitors up to you, or do you lower yourself to compete on their level? And I think that's an issue. But my God, what issues you raise! I'll tell you, fantastic. Well,
I wish I had the opportunity to get through more often. I'm going to have to back out of here and let you wrap things up. I guess.
Okay, buddy. I'll try to wind it up.
I wanted to make sure to try to get through you one more time, because I guess we're not going to have any programs next week, right? And then, am I right? I think Bob said he's going to be away.
No,
so
Bill.
I think that.
Yeah, Bob's going to be away next week. I'm going to be away the week after next.
Yeah, but Bill, you'll be on the air next week.
I'll be on the air next week. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's
Agnes
good.
will be running.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Agnes is going to run the show. Yeah.
Well,
no, we won't have any problem next week.
Because at some point soon, we're going to go through daylight savings again, and then it gets real hard for me to call in live after that. So.
Okay.
All right. I had to take a chance and try to get everything done today, but maybe next week there might still be a chance to do it.
This is great. Boss, thank you so much. Have a great weekend, okay? Thank you very much.
Hope we get to do it again soon. I'll catch you next time.
Oh, we will. Thank you. I love it. Thank you so much. We are at exactly 53 minutes after, so we're in the final countdown, if you will, to the end of our program for today, as well as the end of the program next week. And we'll pick up on this on Monday, because it's very obvious from the points that Horst was making and from the conversation that we had, that I just thoroughly enjoyed, that we've only begun to really scratch the surface on some of these issues, because they are incredibly significant, and they really kind of surface over and over again in different contexts and in different ways. So the ability to really nail down and get our arms around some of these issues is so important. The idea of the Gemeinschaft-Gesellschaft thing, and the issue of trust versus distrust, or the issue of self-interest and faction being sown into the nature of man versus the other side of James Madison. That's really where I plan to go, and we'll go there Monday. And that's what I wanted to look at with the Charles Beard approach to the interpretation of the Constitution and what that all means. But I really do believe that this is a very, very significant, meaningful issue and dialogue, and I just want to thank Horst so much his willingness, because I know it's in the middle of the night there, for heaven's sake, and here he is on the phone with us and trying to give us a little bit of his wisdom before he crashes for the night. I just appreciate that so very, very much. And anyway, I want to thank all of you for tuning in to today's program. We're just within the 5 minutes to the end of the program frame, and I just wanted to kind of wind up with just a couple of closing comments. It seems to me that the theme that I would like to leave you with, and we'll pick it up on Monday, because I believe there's a lot more to this than we've been able to do so far. But the issue that I'd like to, because I think there are many issues here, but the one that I think is really significant, and not that much attention is paid to it, is this issue of the definitive nature of certain studies. That when certain interpretations or certain approaches to particular principles or particular issues become definitive and become generally accepted by society at large, to the point that other options or other alternatives never get an opportunity to surface, then that reinforces and strengthens the idea that the definitive study is indeed truth, and that there really is no more to say about the subject. The point that I wanted to make, and continue to want to make, is that throughout history, individuals with power and influence are able to seize upon particular interpretations and particular issues and drive them home as definitive. Because what they tend to do is repress the alternatives. And in the process, they redefine the very nature of learning and education itself. Because learning ceases to be investigation and ceases to be seeking the answers to questions. Learning becomes rather the mastering of truth as defined by somebody else. And the implication is that once you have a definitive study that is disseminating truth, then all other options become insignificant, and your principal responsibility is to master that truth. That's extremely dangerous. And I would suggest to you that's what's happening, that's what happens in society throughout period after period, not only in our history, but in the history of other nations as well. It's what's happening today. The idea that Jefferson's Declaration is Lockean without question means that you can build the whole natural rights philosophy on top of that foundation. So if you question that foundation, you potentially topple the philosophy itself. And that's, it seems to me, what we're really focusing on here when we talk about the issue of real learning and expanding our minds and all the rest of it. I hope that you have enjoyed today's program half as much as I have. I want to thank Horst for calling, and I want to make sure that everybody has a wonderful evening and the wonderful rest of the week and weekend. We will be here with the Virtual Center at our regular time next Monday. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center, thanking you very, very much and bidding you good day, and please be safe. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Thank you.